hadn't planned on revisiting Wildlands in 2026. Funny how things come back around. I recently went back to one of my first ever videos on this channel, No Man's Sky, and now here I am exploring Wildlands again, the second video I ever made for this channel. So 3 years on, it feels quite fitting that I found myself returning to a game that played a small part in the early days of this channel. And the reason for coming back? Well, that's where things get interesting. The latest update for Wildlands, Last Rites, came as somewhat a surprise. I follow a lot of Ubisoft titles and their social channels, and somehow I completely missed the update, and even the rumours surrounding it. So in many ways, this did feel like it came out of nowhere. But here we are, 3 years after my original Wildlands video. I'm back in Bolivia to see what Last Rite brings to the table, and more importantly, whether this update gives Wildlands a reason to return in 2026. Because this isn't simply about looking at what has been added. I wanted to see how Wildlands feels coming back after all this time, whether the base game still holds up, and ultimately, whether the Last Rites has done enough to breathe some life back into a game that I, and plenty of others, haven't touched in a while. And that's where I'd love to hear from you as well. What are your thoughts on Wildlands? Have you returned because of Last Rites? Or has the update passed you by completely? Let me know in the comments, because it'll be really interesting to hear where you stand. But before we jump into this review, I want to take a quick moment to say thank you to everyone who supported this channel. We recently hit 500 subscribers, and whilst this might be a small milestone in the grand scheme of YouTube, it's one that I'm genuinely grateful for. Every single person who has subscribed, watched a video, left a comment, or supported the channel in some way has helped me get here. And with that, a special thank you to our first channel member as well. It's genuinely appreciated, and I'm excited to see where we can take this channel from here. So, with that out of the way, let's head back into Wildlands and see what Last Rites has to offer. Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon has reached its 25th anniversary, and with that comes a celebration of the series. At the time of writing, there's also a big sale running across the Ghost Recon games until the 16th of August. And alongside that celebration, Ubisoft has brought an update to one of my favourite games in the series, Ghost Recon Wildlands. And for a 9-year-old game, Last Rites is a fairly substantial surprise. The biggest addition is the brand new story mission, introduced the Lorona, the leader of a dangerous cult. The mission takes the Ghost into darker and more hostile territory, and compared to some of the more open-ended missions found within Wildlands, this one has a more linear and atmospheric structure. One thing that's worth pointing out is you don't need to have completed the main mission to access it. So you're jumping into Wildlands specifically to see what Last Rite has to offer. You can get straight into the new content. Alongside the new mission, current gen consoles have also received a significant technical upgrade. Wildlands can now target 4K resolution at 60 FPS, which makes a noticeable difference to the overall experience, particularly when it comes to movement, gunplay and driving. There's also improvements to rendering, lighting, shadows, and overall image quality, helping Wildlands look considerably better, despite the fact that we're dealing with a game that's now 9 years old. But the visual upgrade isn't the only major change. Last Rites also introduces a much deeper level of gameplay customization. You now have additional options covering things such as gameplay rules, difficulty, your HUD and interface, immersion, realism, or world and session settings. And I think this is where the update becomes a little more interesting than simply being a technical upgrade. So, is the Last Rites genuinely new content, a quality of life update, or more of a technical and maintenance update? Well, I actually think it's a mixture of all three. There is some genuine new content here. Personally, I found the Last Rites story mission took around an hour to complete. You go in the mission with everything unlocked, your stats fully maxed, so it feels less like starting another full Wildlands campaign and more like a showcase, and a reminder just how good this game can be. Ironically, the short experience had a much bigger effect on me than I expected. Playing Last Rites actually made me start a fresh playthrough of Wildlands. I found myself excited to explore Bolivia all over again, which isn't something I considered doing before the update arrived. Then there's the current gen changes. From what I've seen, the 4K 60 FPS upgrade is something players have been asking for, so it's good to see Ubisoft actually delivering on that. It's not necessarily something that transforms the fundamental gameplay, but it does make returning to the world feel considerably more appropriate for modern hardware. And that ties into the reason behind the update in the first place. This is part of the celebration of Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon's 25th anniversary. So I think it makes sense that Ubisoft has used this opportunity to revisit Wildlands and give players something new to experience. But how substantial does Last Rites actually feel? Well, in the grand scheme of things, this is still a relatively small update. But for a 9-year-old title, I don't think it's something to be sniffed at. The biggest changes aren't necessarily the mission itself, but the addition of customization options. The new ghost parameters, HUD, and difficulty options give you much more control over how you experience the game. You can customize aspects of realism, challenge, immersion, and interaction, allowing you to tailor the experience much more closely to how you want to play it. And while these options can change the way you experience Wildlands, they don't fundamentally change the gameplay itself. Wildlands still feels like Wildlands. Maybe the few grey hairs on my head has changed the way I approach things slightly, but the core gameplay remains exactly what I remember. There haven't been any drastic changes that suddenly transform the game into something completely different, and honestly, I don't think it needed to be. There are also some other additions worth mentioning without going into every single change. The Predator mission returns, new skins and items have been added, and of course we have the Last Rites mission itself. For the most part, everything integrates naturally into Wildlands. There's one thing worth being aware of though. The new Last Rites mission takes you into a separate game experience. So if you're experiencing Wildlands for the first time, I personally recommend playing through the original storyline first, and then returning to the menu to access Last Rites. That way you're experiencing Wildlands as it was originally intended before jumping into the new content. But perhaps the biggest surprise for me wasn't actually what Ubisoft added. We'll dive into this in much more detail later, but the biggest surprise has been just how good, and most importantly, how fun Wildlands still is after all this time. My original playthrough 3 years ago was done with a squad, and as you might expect, chaos regularly broke loose. This time around though, I played through the game solo, and that completely changed the flow of the game and the way I approached each mission. Instead of relying on a squad and getting caught up in the chaos, I found myself taking a much more deliberate approach. It generally felt like a brand new game. So if you've never played Wildlands before, does this update make it worth picking up? Yes. At the time of writing, Wildlands currently sits around £2 on Steam and around £7 on the PlayStation Store. For that kind of money, there's an enormous amount of value in the base game. But I would make one distinction here. If you're buying Wildlands just for Last Rites, I'd probably reconsider. The new mission itself is relatively short, and that's not where the majority of the value lies. But if Last Rites is what brings you back to Wildlands, then that's a different story. Because for me, playing through Last Rites did something I wasn't expecting it to do. It made me want to replay the original story and explore Bolivia all over again. And for an update to a 9-year-old game that had no plans to return to in 2026, I think that's probably one of the strongest things Last Rites could have achieved. I think whenever you revisit a game that you look back on particularly fondly, there's always a risk that it's going to ruin that memory. You remember the good times, the moments you had, and how much fun you had playing it. But games don't always age as well as we remember them. I haven't touched Wildlands in around 3 years now, so coming back in 2026, there was definitely a question in the back of my mind about whether I would still enjoy it as much as I did the first time around. And whilst I may be a bit older, and hopefully a little wiser, Wildlands itself has remained its fun, chaotic self. Well, depending on how you approach each mission. There is always an intention to approach things as stealthily as possible. Scout an area, mark the enemy, take them out quietly, and complete the objective without raising the alarm. But sometimes I'm a little too trigger happy, and before you know it, all hell breaks loose. And honestly, that's part of the fun. You can try to control how every mission plays out, but Wildlands has always had a way of turning your carefully planned operation into complete chaos. And for me, that's part of what makes the game enjoyable. And ultimately, that's what gaming is all about, having fun. The first thing I noticed when booting up Wildlands again was just how well the game still feels. Despite being 9 years old, it instantly felt familiar. I didn't feel like I had to relearn how to play it, and it didn't take long before I was completely comfortable moving around the world again. Don't get me wrong, there are moments when the age of the game definitely shows. The way your AI squad interacts with vehicles can be a little questionable at times. There are also moments where NPC animations don't load correctly, although perhaps this particular NPC was just trying to hide in plain sight. I'm not entirely sure. But despite those little issues, Wildlands does a great job of pulling you into the world almost immediately. There is a surprising amount of depth and exploration here, and that's something I've always loved about this game. You've got character customization, leveling up abilities, finding new weapons and attachments, and constantly improving your loadout. That gameplay loop still feels enjoyable to me. In fact, one of the biggest compliments I can give Wildlands at this point is that I'm already looking forward to my next session. I want to get back into the game, explore more of Bolivia, and see what I can find. The one area that does feel a little dated to me is the leveling system itself. It can feel a little boring and at times quite hollow. I think it would be more interesting if you could specialise further into a different skill tree and really build your ghost around a particular playstyle. You could have something focused around reconnaissance another built around running and gunning, or perhaps one designed around breaching. That's not a major issue here, and it doesn't stop you from playing those playstyles currently. It's more of something that I would like to see in a progression system, particularly when you consider how much freedom the rest of Wildlands gives you. But if there's one area that Wildlands has always been strong, it's the open world. The exploration is a huge part of the experience. Being able to jump into a variety of different vehicles, whether it's cars, boats, helicopters or planes, and simply travel around Bolivia is still a lot of fun. And the scenery helps with it as well. There are plenty of moments where I found myself driving or flying around and taking in the environment rather than just rushing from one objective to the next. The story also provides a strong anchor in all of this. It gives you a reason to keep moving forward, while the open world gives you the freedom to decide how you want to get there. And so far, that combination still works really well for me. As for frustrations, I haven't encountered anything major during this playthrough that has really broken my immersion. There are some of the usual frustrations that come with an open world game though. Personally, I sometimes find myself burning out when the map is covered in markers and collectibles, and I feel like I have to go around finding and looting everything before moving on to the next area. Whether it's resources, perk points or other collectibles, there can be a temptation to clear everything from the map simply because it's there. Maybe I'll feel differently later in the game, but right now I'm actually enjoying the exploration without feeling compelled to collect absolutely everything. And I think that's important. I'm exploring because I want to, rather than because the game is forcing me to. But has Last Rites actually reignited my interest in playing Wildlands? Absolutely. That's probably my biggest takeaway from this entire experience. Last Rite feels like it's pulled me back into the main game. It's a small piece of new content, but it gave me a reason to return to Wildlands and experience the original game again 3 years after my first playthrough. But rather than playing Last Rites, finishing it, and moving on, I found myself wanting to continue playing. That's probably the biggest compliment I can give the update. If anything, Wildlands now feels better than it did in my memory, and that's where the experience of playing solo compared to playing with friends becomes really interesting. These are two very different experiences. When I originally played Wildlands, I played it as part of a squad. Playing with friends created a completely different pace. The story almost became the line pulling you forward, while the real memories came from the chaos you created together. You'd have a plan, you'd set out to complete a mission, and then something would inevitably go wrong. Playing solo feels much more story-driven. I'm paying more attention to the objectives, taking my time with missions, and approaching situations differently. There's less of that unpredictable chaos that comes with playing with friends, but there's also something more focused about the experience, and that's what surprised me the most. 3 years ago, I enjoyed Wildlands as a squad. 3 years later, I'm enjoying Wildlands just as much as a solo experience. It's a different experience, but it's still the same game underneath. If anything, Last Rites has proved to me that the reason I remembered Wildlands so fondly wasn't simply because of nostalgia. The game itself is still fun. So we've looked at how Last Rite feels, but what about the game underneath? Because ultimately, an update can only do so much. If Wildlands itself hadn't held up, then Last Rites wouldn't have much to bring us back to. And after spending more time with it in 2026, I think the biggest surprise for me is just how well the core game still works. Let's start with the obvious one, the gunplay. You're here to find out how the game actually plays after all this time. And one of the biggest parts of any Ghost Recon experience is, well, the shooting. I'm pleased to say that the gunplay still holds up in 2026. It's satisfying, and the different types of weapons have their own feel depending on what you're using. There are plenty of options available, and while I tend to stick with the same assault rifle and SMG, the variety is certainly there if you want to experiment. I do have one personal problem though, and that's my compulsive reloading. I've lost count of the number of times I've gone to reload when I don't really need to, and this has almost got me killed on a few occasions. But my main sticking point with the gunplay is actually the shoulder switching. It can take a little getting used to, but once you settle into the rhythm with the controls, the gunplay becomes really enjoyable. And that feeds directly into another area where Wildlands continues to work really well, the tactical approach. Playing this game solo has completely changed how it feels to me. It generally feels like a different game compared to my first playthrough. The basic approach is simple. You scope out a compound, mark your enemies, work out your approach, and then infiltrate without being detected. And I really like the fact the game doesn't force you to approach every mission in the exact same way. Some missions require you to enter an area without being detected, while others give you more freedom to go in with a bit more aggression. If you want to run and gun, you can. If you want to take your time, pick enemies off, and remain undetected, you can do that as well. That freedom is a big part of what makes Wildlands works. The sync shot feature is also something I like, although, interestingly, I haven't actually used it all that often during this playthrough. The first time I played Wildlands, it wasn't really an option for me because I was playing with a squad full of friends. This time around, playing solo, it has been more relevant. but I've still actually found myself relying on my own approach rather than constantly using it. And that's partly because of how the AI teammates behave. When you infiltrate a compound, they tend to hold back. It's only when things go wrong and the shit hits the fan that they'll probably come in to help. For the most part, that's actually quite useful. They stay out of the way unless you command them or make use of the sync shot. However, their movement can sometimes feel a little strange and dated. That becomes even more noticeable when you're trying to interact with vehicles. There are certain vehicles that are clearly designed to fit 4 people, yet somehow one member of the squad will just refuse to get in. It's one of those little quirks that reminds you that the game is still 9 years old. I prefer playing this sort of game solo anyway, so I actually quite like having the air squad as backup rather than having them constantly getting in the way. They remain hidden until you're spotted, and once that situation goes loud, they'll engage. And speaking of staying hidden, stealth is incredibly rewarding. Playing undetected gives you more experience, but there's also another major benefit of keeping things quiet. You don't have to deal with the reinforcements. That becomes particularly important when you're dealing with the Unidad, because allowing an encounter to escalate quickly can turn a carefully planned infiltration into a much larger gunfight. So stealth isn't simply there for players who want to take a quieter approach. There are practical reasons to remain undetected, and that makes the tactical gameplay feel meaningful. Then we have the open world, and I think this is where Wildlands continues to shine. One of the things I've learned from playing a lot of open world games is the world itself can be impressive as it wants, but if the narrative doesn't give you a reason to keep moving forward, you can lose interest quickly. That's especially true when you're playing solo. When you're playing with friends, there's always something happening. You're creating your own stories and getting distracted by whatever chaos unfolds. When you're playing alone, you need the narrative thread to keep pulling you forward. And so far, Wildlands has managed to do that for me. As I mentioned earlier, my biggest struggle with open world games is that I've become obsessed with clearing the map. I'll see a collectible, a resource, or a perk point and immediately think, right, I need to go and get that. And eventually that can lead to burnout. But so far, I haven't had much of an issue with that in Wildlands because I've been so invested in the narrative. I'm exploring because I want to rather than feeling I have to clear every single marker on the map. And that brings us nicely to Bolivia itself. The world building in Wildlands is one of the standout features of this game. Bolivia is beautifully constructed, and even after all this time, I think it still looks incredible. The day-night cycle combined with the changing weather helps the world feel alive rather than simply being a backdrop for missions. And there's a huge amount of variety in the environments. You're moving through different landscapes, different types of roads and different areas of Bolivia. And even the driving can feel different depending on the surface you're travelling across. There are some textures that obviously show their age in the game. The most notable issues I've experienced is when flying a helicopter over the map, where some of the ground textures don't quite load in as quickly as you'd expect. But it's a relatively minor distraction. When you're actually immersed in the world, those imperfections are easily overlooked. The world also benefits from a day-night cycle. The time of day can change how you approach a mission, particularly when moving into darker areas and need to rely on your night vision goggles. A full day takes around 72 minutes in-game, so you're constantly moving through different lighting conditions as you play. Weather also adds to the feeling of a living world. Rain and changing conditions affect the environment, the roads and the surfaces around you, whilst also creating reflections that can make the world feel considerably more dynamic. It's these little details that help sell Bolivia as somewhere you're actually travelling through, rather than simply a collection of mission locations. Then we have the progression, and this is an area where Wildlands still gets a lot right, even if I think there's room for improvement. Putting perk points into skill tree gives you meaningful rewards. You're unlocking equipment and abilities such as the parachute and C4, whilst also improving your drone capabilities and reducing weapon sway. So there is a genuine sense that your character is becoming more capable as you progress. I still think I'd like to have the ability to specialise more heavily in a particular playstyle, but I wouldn't really call that a criticism of the current system. It's more something I would have liked to see as an additional difficulty or customisation option. The current progression system works, and it still provides a meaningful reason to continue putting points into your character. There's also a good selection of weapons and build options. You've got plenty of different weapon types available, and you can start finding more through exploration. I personally tend to stick to the same assault rifle and SMG because they feel comfortable to me. There may well be better options available, but I haven't felt the need to constantly change my loadout. And that's perhaps where the progression system doesn't necessarily encourage as much experimentation as it could. Your weapons give you the biggest opportunity to experiment with different approaches. The skill tree might encourage that experimentation early on, but later in the game you'll have earned enough points that you can eventually unlock and max out the whole tree. Again, that's not something that stops the game from being enjoyable, but it does mean the progression doesn't necessarily force you into making difficult choices about how you want to build your ghost. And then there's the elephant in the room, co-op. This time around I haven't spent as much time playing co-op to give you a fresh opinion on how it's held up over these years. So this one I'd actually like to put back to you. How do you feel Wildlands holds up in co-op after all this time? Do you think it's a better game when playing with friends, or do you prefer experiencing it solo? Based on my original playthrough, I'd say they're almost two different experiences built on the same map. Playing solo allows you to be more calculated. You can take your time, approach missions at your own pace, and focus more heavily on the story. Playing with friends, on the other hand, brings a different level of fun. The story becomes the line pulling you from one objective to the next, while the memories you create come from the chaos that happened along the way. And that's something I remember very fondly from my first playthrough. Finally, we have to talk about how the game has aged. I'm not going to be too harsh on Wildlands here. It's a 9-year-old game, and you have to expect a certain amount of age to show. There are some texture issues, particularly when you're flying around the map. The AI can behave strangely in certain situations, and some of the animations and interactions definitely remind you that this isn't a modern release. But overall, the game still feels and plays incredibly well. And importantly, during my time with it, I haven't encountered any major issues with drop frames or crashes. For a game that was released 9 years ago, that's pretty impressive. So while Wildlands certainly isn't perfect, I don't think it needs to be. The core gameplay is still satisfying, the tactical approach still works, the open world remains enjoyable to explore, and the Bolivia continues to be a fantastic setting. There are definitely areas where you can see the age of the game. But when you put it all together, I think Wildlands has aged remarkably well. And perhaps that's the biggest reason why Last Rites has worked for me. The update didn't need to reinvent Wildlands, it just needed to remind me why I enjoyed it in the first place. So, after spending all this time in Wildlands again, the question I keep coming back to is whether Last Rites is the final chapter for the game. And honestly, it is. But this game alone, and not the series. Last Rite feels more like a showcase of what Wildlands was, a reminder of what the Ghost Recon series can be, and perhaps a reminder of what could come next. It has given me a chance to step back into Bolivia, experience a new story, and more importantly, rediscover what made Wildlands so enjoyable in the first place. And that has left me genuinely intrigued about where the series goes next. Because I think The Last Rites has shown that Wildlands still matters. And I don't just mean because it's a popular Ghost Recon game. Wildlands matters because, depending on how you choose to experience it, it offers something that I don't think has really been replicated since. Playing solo or playing co-op gives you very different experiences, but both of them work. Solo gives you that more calculated, methodical approach. You can take your time, plan your attacks, and become immersed in the story. Co-op gives you something completely different. You're still working through the same world and the same missions, but the stories you remember come from the things that happen along the way. The chaos and mistakes, the moments that you never planned for, and then there's Bolivia itself. The combination of the world, the open-ended missions, and the storytelling created an experience that, for me, hasn't really been replicated since. The games that follow Wildlands haven't captured the same level of immersion or storytelling that pulled me into Bolivia from the very beginning. And that's why I think this update feels more than just a piece of new content. It does feel like a celebration of Wildlands. This is a 9-year-old game, and Ubisoft has still chosen to come back to it, provide a graphical update for current-gen consoles, add new content, and give players more control over how they experience the game. And I think it's nice to see that Ubisoft has acknowledged the community in that way. It's a good reminder that there's still an appetite for this type of Ghost Recon experience. And that brings me to what I'd want from the next Ghost Recon. I really hope the next game leans into what makes Wildlands great. It feels like the gaming industry has gradually stepped away from this type of open world experience. When you think about games like Just Cause 2, it feels like we haven't had an open world shooter quite like these games in a long time. Maybe these types of games were simply done to death. Maybe gamers became fatigued with them in a way that we've seen fatigue around battle royales or multiplayer shooters like Call of Duty. But perhaps we're now seeing a resurgence. And if that's the case, I'm absolutely here for it. Because coming back to Wildlands 3 years after my original playthrough, I can see exactly why this type of game still works. There's something incredibly satisfying about having a huge world, being given a target, and then being allowed to decide how you're going to approach it. And I'm genuinely excited to see what comes next for Ghost Recon. But does Last Rites do enough to bring people back? Well, if you're thinking about buying the game purely for Last Rites, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. There's simply not enough new content here to justify doing that on its own. However, I think that's actually missing the biggest point of this update. Last Rites isn't necessarily valuable because of how much content it adds. It's valuable because it made me want to play Wildlands again. I came back for Last Rites, and now I'm playing through the main story again. That's something I wasn't expecting to happen when I started this review. And so, is this goodbye? Honestly, it doesn't really feel like it. If anything, Last Rite feels like a little reminder from Ubisoft that Ghost Recon is still here, and that there's potentially something new on the horizon. Obviously don't know what's going to come next. I'm not going to pretend that this update tells us exactly where the series is heading, but the timing of this update, alongside the 25th anniversary celebration, makes it feel less like a final goodbye and more like a showcase of what Ghost Recon can still be, and that's left me feeling optimistic. So if this is Wildlands' last hurrah, it leaves behind a game that still feels fun, it still feels immersive, and most importantly, it still feels worth playing 9 years later. Last Rites hasn't reinvented Wildlands, it didn't need to. Instead, it reminded me why I love this game in the first place, and perhaps that's the most fitting way for Wildlands to be remembered. So here we are, at the end of another video, and potentially the last time we look at Wildlands on this channel. I'll be honest, I didn't think we'd ever revisit this game. 3 years after my original video, I certainly wasn't expecting to come back to Bolivia, reviewing another chapter of Wildlands. And I'm still a little surprised that Ubisoft added new content to a 9-year-old game. But I'm glad they did. Last Rites might only give you around an hour of new gameplay, but alongside the graphical improvements, gameplay customizations, new items and other changes, it feels like a worthwhile update to an already impressive game. It shows its age in certain places, there's no denying that. But after coming back into one of my favourite games, the most important thing I've taken away from this experience is that it still feels good to play, and that's what you want from a game. Wildlands gives you a solid tactical shooter set within an incredibly well-built world. You've got a strong narrative that keeps driving your progression forward, but at the same time, you're given the freedom to explore Bolivia, discover new weapons, collect resources, and earn skill points that all feed back into your character progression. There's a lot here, and if you're picking Wildlands up while it's on offer, there's even more value to be found. At the time of writing, there's still a week left on the sale, with Wildlands available for around £2 on Steam and around £7 on the PlayStation Store. At those prices, I think it's an absolute no-brainer if you're interested in tactical shooters or open world games. I wouldn't necessarily recommend picking up purely for Last Rites. There's simply not enough new content in the chapter alone to justify buying the game. But I think there's a good chance that, like me, you'll finish the Last Rites and find yourself wanting to go back to the main story. So how does it feel to return to Wildlands in 2026? It feels good to be back in Bolivia. The mechanics still feel good, the gunplay is solid, and the world remains incredibly enjoyable to explore. I actually don't think I have anything negative to say about this game. Of course, there are some janky textures, there are moments where the AI does something a little strange, and there are parts of the game where you can definitely see its age. But I think you can be overly critical of some of these things when you're looking at a 9-year-old title in 2026. None of it really hurt my experience or broke the immersion. I've had a lot of fun traversing Bolivia, I've had fun taking on the missions, I've had fun playing this solo, and remembering what it was like to play with friends. And ultimately, Wildlands still holds up. So why is Wildlands so good? I think it's that balance between structure and freedom. You've got a narrative that gives you a reason to keep moving forward, but you're never completely restricted by it. You can explore with your customizable ghost, you can find new weapons and develop your abilities, you can approach missions stealthily, or you can completely mess up your plan and end up in a massive gunfight. And whether you're playing solo or with friends, that freedom creates an experience that still feels incredibly enjoyable. And perhaps that's what Wildlands means to Ghost Recon now. It feels like a reminder of what the series can be. Last Rite hasn't reinvented Wildlands, and I don't think it needed to. Instead, it has reminded players that this game still has something worth coming back to. And as for whether this is goodbye for Ghost Recon, I don't think it is. We've seen Ubisoft launch the Insider program, so it feels like we're moving towards something rather than away from it. And after playing Wildlands again, I'm generally excited to see what comes next. So, after returning to Wildlands in 2026, was it worth coming back? Absolutely. And that brings us to the rating. I originally was going to give Wildlands a 4 out of 5, but then I thought about it. Why? Why am I taking that final point away? The gunplay is solid, the world building is impressive, the open world exploration is fantastic, the progression and tactical gameplay still hold up, and I've had an incredible amount of fun experiencing the game both solo and as part of a squad. Yes, there are some dated textures. Yes, the AI can still act a little strange, and the progression system could potentially offer more specializations. But none of those things have stopped me enjoying Wildlands. So actually, screw it. Wildlands gets a 5 out of 5 from me. And I generally can't think of a reason not to. For less than £7 or around £2 on Steam at the time of writing, there is an enormous amount of content here. We've got a huge world to explore, a strong narrative, plenty of weapons and abilities to unlock, and the choice to experience either as a solo or with friends. And now you've got a new, albeit short chapter in the Last Rites on top of that. So if you've never played Wildlands before, I think now is a fantastic time to jump in. And if you've already played it, maybe it's time to head back to Bolivia. I know I have. It feels like the beginning of something, and I'm excited to see where it goes. But that's all from me. I'd love to know what you think. Are you back in Bolivia exploring the Wildlands? Let me know in the comments. And once again, thank you so much for the 500 subscribers on YouTube. It generally means the world that we're building a strong community here. And I'm incredibly grateful to everyone who has supported the channel so far. If you're new and want to continue this video game journey with me, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye!